has this deal, for the most part, gone as you expected, or have things sort of thrown you off a little bit in any respect?
Well, I personally was only surprised that the FTC rushed to court. They really went to their in-house court in mid-December. They could have waited until January. They were not under a hard deadline at the point. Now, later, of course, many of us read about that potential explanation, which was that they were trying to somehow influence the European Commission. I'm not sure it really had an impact on what the EU did. I think they are
I don't think so.
Yeah, I think, for example, there was that interview a few days ago on Bloomberg that the EU's executive vice president, Vestager, Margrethe Vestager, gave to Bloomberg. And I think in that interview, there were 3 potential sideswipes at the FTC. First, she said that she's not going to allow regulatory capture by any party. That was interesting. Obviously, she didn't say by Sony. She said by either party, but still, I mean, we all know that if there has been any regulatory capture so far, we would know it would have occurred in Washington, D.C., and we know by whom. The second part there was that she said regulators should not be in a race to the first decision. That was, I think, a very clear reference to what was, rumored to have been the FTC's motive to get that thing out. And then she, I think, also started to prepare people for, potentially reaching different conclusions than organizations in other jurisdictions. But anyways, I mean, that surprised me in December. I really thought, and then when I saw that complaint, it frankly and seriously, it surprised me how weak it seemed.
Oh, yeah. Like if you actually go through and read the FTC's complaint, they literally make up terms for the console market. They say like, oh, only PlayStation and Xbox are the only 2 market participants, really. And the whole argument is based around that. I find that to be just kind of crazy, like to just totally discount Nintendo. And then we're hearing things like some people think that the Nintendo Switch can't run Call of Duty. It's just, there's versions of Call of Duty that would run on the Switch. Like they can get Doom Eternal running on the Switch. They can probably figure out how to optimize Call of Duty for that platform. And all these, go ahead.
I mean, sorry, I interrupted again, but also the way that the FTC tried to mislead the average reader as to what happened after that ZeniMax Bethesda acquisition. They were not lying per se. I don't mean to allege that, right? But they made it sound like Microsoft had broken a promise they had made to the EU. And Microsoft had been very clear that future titles, the platforms on which they would release future titles, would be decided on a case-by-case basis. They would cross the bridge when they get there. They had only made it clear that they would leave the existing titles on all those platforms, which as of today they have. And that was something that I felt that was like an attempt to somehow, make a political, psychological type of argument. Especially, it doesn't really mean anything when you have a situation like now where Microsoft is prepared to make a binding commitment. They've offered Sony a contract. They've told the regulators that they are also fine with something that the regulators can enforce and oversee, or have a third party oversee, as we discussed before. And against that background, I just thought it was almost like a gratuitous attack to bring up that whole ZeniMax Bethesda story. And there are still people out there, and commentators, even relatively well-respected commentators, who still somehow in the back of their heads believe that Microsoft had not made good on a promise here to regulators, which is just insane.
Yeah. I don't remember who it was. It was either the EU or the CMA. They actually responded to the FTC statement and they said that is not true. Well, that's not quite what they said. That's not quite what they said, but they alluded to the fact that that wasn't considered in their proceedings, and indicating that the FTC got it wrong, basically. So if the FTC was trying to create an environment where everybody was sort of focused on the same objective, I feel like they actually kind of put themselves out on an island. Well, the EU and the CMA are just going to figure out whatever and then let the FTC sort it out.
The FTC, I think, in a very strictly legalistic sense, everything that the FTC said was true, but it was grossly misleading. The average person reading that story for the first time by looking at the FTC complaint could really get a completely wrong impression. And I think all that the EU wanted to do is counter that false impression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Now we found out that Sony is going to have to turn over a ton of documents to the FTC case and basically give Microsoft a lot of information they requested. I believe it's the last 4 years of information. There is a protective order on that, but real quick, can you explain what that protective order will actually be protecting? Because even if you look at the original filing, there's documents that are protected, but we still get all that text with redactions, and like a bunch of stories came out of that information. So should we expect sort of the same thing with a synopsis at the lead and then the exhibits are redacted? What's that going to look like when those documents come into the case?
Right. I mean, obviously, if they get like 1 million documents, they're not all going to show up somewhere, not even in a redacted form. But first, Microsoft's outside counsel, Microsoft's counsel of record, is now going to get all of that material. And they obviously are not allowed to disclose anything confidential to their client. But they are allowed, of course, to identify any facts that have a bearing on the resolution of this case. And if they are relevant and they make those arguments, then that means that at the end of the day, the most important points, the juiciest parts potentially, will somehow be used in the further proceedings. Mm-hmm. It's another question whether that trial that has been scheduled in the FTC case for August is actually going to go forward. Because if we now take like an optimistic perspective on yesterday's news and assume that by late April, the EU and the UK may have green-lighted the deal based on certain conditions, then it's quite possible that the FTC would accept the same or similar commitments and settle. They've never totally closed the door to that. They just wanted to sue at some point. But if that trial happens in August, that is in principle public proceeding. They can seal the courtroom. They can ask everybody except parties and counsel to leave for parts of the trial. Then there's also that California lawsuit, the so-called gamers lawsuit. Mm-hmm. That's going to be even more public than the FTC. And the question is, how long is that going to go? Because they're not going to give up if they don't get an injunction against the deal. They've already said in one of their recent filings that in that case, they will like shift gears and seek damages. So they're going to keep suing until they get some money out of this or lose after exhausting all appeals. That means that there are various ways in which those documents could be attached to motions, like summary judgment motions, where you ask the judge to decide something ahead of a trial, can be used, can show up during public trials where there will be depositions. So, for example, like Microsoft's counsel questioning Sony executives at such a trial as witnesses, and confronting them with some of those documents. So yes, in the short term, the protective order takes care of it. But in the long run, it's like a ticking time bomb for Sony that a lot of these things will show up. And one last point about this is that those lawyers in the California lawsuit, who now will also have access to a lot of the stuff, if not all of the stuff that shows up in the FTC record, they are class action lawyers. Their business is to bring lawsuits against big companies, and Sony is more than big enough for that purpose. Mm-hmm. And if they discover anything that they believe enables them to state a claim to bring an antitrust lawsuit on behalf of other gamers, or even the same gamers, against Sony, they will do that. Mm-hmm. There already is a class action lawsuit against Sony. It's called PlayStation You Owe Us in the UK. Brought by other lawyers. There's no.
I think I remember that one actually. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. And I mean, I'm not taking a position on the merits of that. It's about Sony charging 30%, keeping 30% of the income of most game makers. Some game makers have apparently been able, like Activision Blizzard, to negotiate sweetheart terms. But so that is all of these risks that Sony is taking. I don't know whether they are worth it to them, but that's their decision. It's their call. I'm not running Sony.
Yeah. Thank you so much for watching this clip. If you watched this far, please consider hitting subscribe, hitting that bell to know when all my content goes live. Don't miss out. Thank you so much to all of the members for supporting. I really, really appreciate you. Some of you have been there for the last several years watching the channel grow. If you want to support the channel, you can do so by clicking that join button. I post all my videos with no ads. And be sure to check out this video about why I think Starfield is going to be a huge game for Xbox. Bye for now, everybody. I'll see you for the next one. Outro.